The lone security at the old factory. It was another quiet Sunday night. Thomas sat alone in the security room of the old factory. The building was huge and he was the only one working. His job was simple: make sure nothing happened while the factory was closed. But the job wasn't easy. The building was dark and empty, and sometimes it felt like there was something else there with him. He looked at the clock. It was already past midnight. The silence felt heavy. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional flicker of the lights above. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the long shift, but he couldn't let himself fall asleep. He had to stay alert. There was something about working alone in the middle of the night that made everything feel different. Strange, unsettling. The factory had been around for decades, and over the years it had become less and less busy. Most of the machines were old, covered in dust, and hadn't worked in years. The workers had all gone home hours ago, leaving only Thomas to keep watch. He wasn't afraid, but there was always a strange feeling in the air when he worked these late shifts. Sometimes he thought he heard noises coming from the halls. Faint footsteps or a door creaking open. But when he checked, there was never anyone there. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was thick with a strange chill. His flashlight flickered on and off, like it was fighting to stay on. It made his skin crawl. He gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to ignore the unease that settled in his stomach. He stood up and stretched. The building was too quiet, too still. He had made his rounds earlier, checking all the doors and windows. Everything was locked, just as it should be. But still, something didn't feel right. He walked over to the window and looked outside. The streets were empty, nothing moved. Only the glow of the streetlights illuminated the darkness, stretching long shadows across the pavement. He turned back to the room. The computer screen that showed the security cameras blinked once, then went black. The lights flickered again. Thomas frowned. It was strange. The system had been working perfectly all night. Suddenly, the sound of something scraping across the floor echoed down the hallway. Thomas froze. He wasn't sure if it was real or just his mind playing tricks on him, but it was unmistakable. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved. He glanced at the security monitors. There was nothing on the screen. The hallways were empty, yet the sound continued, growing louder. His heart began to race. He had checked every hallway, every corner. No one was there. The factory was empty, or at least it should have been. He grabbed his radio. "Hello? Anyone there?" he asked, his voice sounding small and shaky. No response. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't ignore it. Something was happening. The scraping sound was closer now, echoing louder with each passing second. It sounded like it was coming from just down the hall. Slowly, he stood up from the desk. His flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie light around the room. The sound was louder now, much louder. He felt his pulse quicken, his throat tightening. He stepped out of the room, his footsteps almost drowned out by the noise. The hallway stretched in front of him, dark and empty. He took a deep breath and walked down the hallway, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scraping sound stopped. He stopped too. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Thomas could feel his heart thumping in his chest. It was like the whole building was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered once again. This time, they didn't just flicker. They went out completely. Thomas gasped. The whole building was plunged into darkness. The only light was from his flashlight, but even that was weak, the beam flickering in and out. He shone the light down the hall. Nothing. But something was wrong. The air felt different now, thicker, colder. It pressed against him, making him feel like he couldn't breathe. He strained his ears, trying to hear anything. There was nothing. No sounds, no movement. Or was he? Without warning, a loud crash rang out from the far end of the hallway. Something had fallen. Thomas turned, his heart racing. He couldn't see anything, but he knew he had to check. There was no other choice. He walked toward the sound, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The air grew colder, the silence growing heavier with each step. He turned a corner and came to the end of the hallway. There in front of him was a large metal door. It had been locked earlier in the night, but now it was wide open, just enough for him to see inside. The door creaked as it swung slowly, revealing only darkness. Then a soft, low whisper echoed from within the room. "Thomas." Thomas froze. He had heard it clearly. It was a voice, low and faint, but unmistakable. He wanted to turn and run. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but something kept him there. The voice, soft but clear, called his name again. "Thomas, come inside." A chill ran down his spine. It sounded like it was coming from the darkness itself. He stepped forward. The door creaked again as it swung open wider. Thomas couldn't see what was inside, but the feeling of dread washed over him like a wave. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn around and run back to the safety of the security room. But his feet moved on their own, drawing him closer to the door. The light from his flashlight barely cut through the darkness inside. But as he stepped forward, the beam illuminated something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood in the darkness, unmoving, just beyond the light. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows. It was standing perfectly still, watching him. Thomas felt his chest tighten, and his heart raced faster than he could process. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Thomas." The voice was different now, deeper, colder. It wasn't human. Thomas didn't wait for it to speak again. His feet finally obeyed, and he turned to run. But the hallway seemed longer now. The lights above flickered wildly as he sprinted back toward the security room. But the sounds, the scraping, the whispering, the footsteps followed him, echoing off the walls. Just as he reached the door, the lights went out again, plunging the hallway into darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the soft, eerie whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "It's too late, Thomas." The dark corner. Thomas's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled down the hallway, his mind racing, heart pounding. The factory's endless corridors felt like they were closing in on him. The walls seemed to shift, leaning in as if they were alive, watching him. His flashlight flickered again, casting jerky, unreliable beams of light into the oppressive darkness. What was happening? He could feel the sweat on his forehead, his hands shaking. The whisper, the cold presence, the figure standing in the dark. It all felt too real, too close. He reached the security room door and slammed it open, his legs weak as he staggered inside. He slammed the door shut behind him, the heavy metal making a dull thud. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling like he had just run miles. He grabbed the radio, his hands trembling. "Hello," he shouted into the device. His voice cracked. "Is anyone out there?" There was no answer. The silence was deafening. He held the radio to his ear, willing any sound to come through. Nothing. He could feel his panic rising, like a knot in his stomach that he couldn't untie. Suddenly, the lights above flickered again, casting shadows across the room. His eyes darted around, as if expecting something to jump out from the corners. But it was still. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to calm himself. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me. I'm alone. There's nothing here." But as soon as he opened his eyes, he saw it. A shadow moved, just a flicker in the corner of the room. It was gone before he could focus on it, but it was enough to make his heart stop for a moment. "Hello?" he called out again, but his voice sounded too small, too weak in the face of the overwhelming silence. His flashlight still in hand, he slowly stood up, moving toward the door. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a cold chill creeping down his spine. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he needed to check the halls. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'm just too tired. His breath caught in his throat. Then a loud bang echoed from deep in the factory. It came from the direction of the old production floor. The sound was sharp, like metal crashing against concrete, and it made Thomas flinch. His heart raced, and his instincts screamed at him to run. But instead, he stepped forward. "Who's there?" he called into the darkness. The only answer was the sound of his own voice, echoing back to him, empty and hollow. The factory seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. The hallway was long, too long. He couldn't see the end, just more shadows and darkness. The lights above flickered again, casting unsettling patterns on the floor. He took a deep breath and walked forward, his flashlight beam bouncing as he moved. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing in on him. He reached the first corner, his feet dragging. There was no noise now, no scraping, no whispering, only silence. But the silence felt wrong. It was too deep, too thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. Thomas rounded the corner, shining the light down the next hall. He froze. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the figure. It was tall, its shape blurred in the shadows. It was human, but it wasn't. The edges of its form seemed to twist and move, like it wasn't entirely real. It stood perfectly still, not moving, not breathing, but Thomas could feel it. He could feel its eyes on him, staring through the darkness, watching him. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. His pulse hammered in his ears as his legs felt like they were turning to stone. He wanted to turn and run, but his body wouldn't listen. It was like he was stuck, frozen in place by the presence of the thing in front of him. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak, but Thomas could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto him. A sudden flash of movement broke the stillness. The figure took a step forward. Slowly, deliberately, the sound of its foot hitting the concrete floor echoed in the silence. Thomas's breath caught in his throat, his legs trembling as he took a step back. The flashlight in his hand wavered, the beam flickering, casting erratic light on the walls. "What is this?" He could barely think. The terror was overwhelming, a pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Then the figure spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Thomas." The voice was deep, unnatural. It wasn't human. It didn't sound like anything Thomas had ever heard before. "You've been warned." Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The voice echoed in his mind, a sickening, twisted sound that wrapped around his thoughts. Without thinking, his legs finally obeyed, and he turned, running back down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. His flashlight bounced wildly in his hand, casting fleeting beams of light as he sprinted. He could hear the figure's voice again, faint, distant, but still following him, calling to him. "Thomas!" The door to the security room was just ahead. He was almost there. His heart was in his throat, and his mind screamed at him to hurry. The door was within reach, but just as his hand touched the handle, the lights flickered one last time. The room went dark. He turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. But the figure was there, standing in front of him, blocking the door. The thing was closer now. Its shape had sharpened, its outline clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face, it had no face. Just a blank space where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The darkness around it seemed to bend and twist, like the figure itself was made of shadows, not flesh. "It's too late, Thomas," the voice said again, this time louder, almost a growl. Thomas tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice lost in the suffocating darkness. He turned and ran again, but there was no way out. The hallway stretched endlessly, and no matter how fast he ran, the figure was always there, always just a few steps behind. The cold air pressed against him. He could feel the weight of the darkness closing in around him, suffocating him. And then everything went black. The Awakening. When Thomas woke up, it was morning. The sun was rising outside the factory, casting a dull light through the windows. He was sitting in the security room, his body stiff, his mind clouded. The air felt still, unnervingly still. The factory was silent, empty, just as it had been before. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the fog from his brain. The events from the night felt like a dream, a terrible, terrifying dream. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something had happened, something he couldn't explain. But as he stood up and glanced around the room, everything seemed normal. No shadows, no figure, no voices, just silence. And then, as if it had never been gone, he heard it again. The scraping sound.